A peacock's entire existence is a performance. Not a metaphorical performance, an actual, biological, obsessive performance. Every single day, a peacock wakes up and spends hours maintaining, grooming, and displaying its tail. Hours. For what? For the possibility that a peahen might notice. That's it. That's the entire motivation. And here's what's wild. The peahen doesn't care that much. She's not sitting around amazed by the tail. She's just using it as one data point among many to decide if this is a viable mate. But the peacock is convinced that the tail is everything. The peacock believes that if he can just make the tail bigger, shinier, more perfect, then everything will work out. Then he'll be chosen. Then he'll matter. This is the ego problem of peacocks. And it's everywhere in human society. The peacock's tail is objectively a terrible adaptation. It's massive, it's heavy, it makes the bird slower, it makes him more vulnerable to predators. The tail is, by any rational measure, a handicap. The peacock would be better off without it. Faster, safer, more efficient. But the peacock has this tail anyway, because at some point, females started preferring males with bigger tails. And once that preference existed, the tail became self-perpetuating. Males with bigger tails got more mates. Those offspring inherited the preference for big tails and the genetics for big tails. And now you have a peacock so committed to maintaining this massive, useless, beautiful tail that he's essentially crippled by it. But the peacock doesn't see it as a handicap. The peacock sees it as his entire identity. When a peacock displays, he's not thinking, "I hope this works out." He's thinking, "Look at me. Look at how magnificent I am. How could you not choose me?" The peacock has completely internalized the idea that the tail is proof of his value. He's built his entire sense of self around it. Here's the thing that matters. The tail doesn't actually prove the peacock's value at all. The tail just proves that the peacock has spent a lot of energy maintaining the tail. That's literally all it proves. A big tail doesn't make a better father. A big tail doesn't make a better provider. A big tail doesn't mean the peacock is smarter or stronger or more capable. The tail is pure vanity, and the peacock has convinced himself and everyone around him that vanity is the most important metric. This is the ego trap. The ego says, if I can just be impressive enough, if I can just perform well enough, if I can just make myself look good enough, then I'll be valuable. And the peacock has fallen completely into this trap. The peacock spends all his energy on display because he believes the display is what matters. And the problem is, it sort of works. Peahens do choose males with bigger tails. So the peacock strategy actually produces results, for a while. But here's where it gets interesting, because a peacock with an enormous tail is also a peacock that's constantly stressed about maintaining it. A peacock with a massive tail is a peacock that's constantly vulnerable. A peacock that spent all his time grooming and displaying is a peacock that hasn't spent time doing literally anything else. He hasn't built skills. He hasn't built relationships. He hasn't built anything except the appearance of value. And the moment something goes wrong, the moment a predator shows up, the moment food becomes scarce, the moment competition increases, the peacock's entire strategy fails. Because all he has is the tail. He has no backup plan. He has no actual competence. He just has an increasingly desperate performance. This is what ego does to people. The ego says, Your value is determined by how impressive you appear. And so the person spends all their energy on the appearance. They build a career that looks impressive but provides no actual satisfaction. They maintain relationships that look good from the outside but are hollow inside. They pursue status and recognition because they've internalized the belief that being impressive is the same as being valuable. And for a while, it works. People respond to the performance. People treat the impressive person as important. People give the impressive person opportunities and attention. But here's the cost. The impressive person has nothing underneath the impression. When the performance cracks, there's nothing there. When the outside pressure increases, there's no internal foundation to fall back on. The peacock with a massive tail is fundamentally a fragile creature. One bad molt and the whole identity falls apart. Let's talk about how peacocks actually compete with each other, because this is where the ego problem becomes really obvious. When two peacocks meet, they don't fight. They don't establish dominance through actual combat. They display. They spread their tails and they perform. And the peacock with the bigger, more impressive tail usually wins without a single physical altercation. The other peacock just backs down. But here's the thing. The other peacock isn't backing down because the tail actually makes the first peacock stronger or more dangerous. The other peacock is backing down because the first peacock's performance was more impressive. The first peacock convinced the second peacock through pure display that it wasn't worth fighting. The second peacock accepted the illusion of superiority and moved on. This happens constantly in human hierarchies. Two people meet. One of them performs confidence. One of them performs authority. One of them has the bigger tail, and the other person just accepts it. They don't challenge. They don't test the performance. They just assume that the impressive person is actually superior, and they defer. And the impressive person walks away thinking they've won because they're actually better, when really they've just won because they were better at performing. The ego loves this. The ego says, see, you're winning, you're superior, everyone recognizes your value. But what's actually happened is that you've convinced people to treat you as superior through a performance, and now you're dependent on that performance. The moment you stop displaying, the moment the performance cracks, the moment someone calls your bluff, the whole thing collapses. Here's another thing about peacocks. They're incredibly territorial. A peacock doesn't just display for peahens. A peacock displays for other peacocks. A peacock displays for no one in particular. A peacock displays because displaying is what peacocks do. The performance has become self-perpetuating. The peacock is no longer displaying to achieve something. The peacock is displaying because the peacock's identity is built around being a displayer. This is where ego becomes pathological. When the performance is no longer about achieving an outcome, but about maintaining an identity. When the person isn't trying to accomplish something impressive, they're trying to be someone impressive. They're not trying to build something. They're trying to appear like they've built something. They're not living their life. They're curating their life for an audience that may or may not actually exist. And the tragic part is that this often comes from insecurity. The peacock with the biggest tail isn't confident. The peacock with the biggest tail is insecure. The peacock is overcompensating for something. The peacock is terrified that without the tail, Without the performance, without the constant display, he's not actually valuable. So the peacock doubles down. The peacock makes the tail bigger. The peacock performs more intensely. The peacock needs the validation more desperately. Meanwhile, a peacock that's actually secure doesn't need a massive tail. A peacock that's actually confident in his value doesn't spend all day displaying. A secure peacock can just exist. A secure peacock can fail and not have an identity crisis. A secure peacock can be ignored and not feel worthless. But the ego doesn't allow for this. The ego says security comes from being impressive. The ego says your value is determined by external validation. The ego says you need to be special, you need to be seen, you need to matter. And so the peacock keeps building the tail. And the person keeps building the resume, the social media presence, the public persona. Anything to prove that they're valuable. Here's what's interesting. If you actually look at what peacocks are doing with all this energy they're spending on display, it's remarkable what they're not doing. They're not building anything. They're not creating anything. They're not solving problems. They're not helping anyone. They're just making themselves look good. And we call this success. We've built an entire society around peacock behavior. We call it ambition. We call it drive. We call it excellence. And on the surface, it looks admirable. The person who's always displaying, always performing, always trying to be impressive, we respect that. We treat that as virtue. We reward it. We give it attention and status and money. But underneath, it's the same insecurity that drives a peacock to build a tail he can barely carry. It's the same desperation. It's the same fundamental misunderstanding about where value actually comes from. Because here's the thing that nobody wants to admit. Being impressive and being valuable are not the same thing. You can be very impressive and have no actual value. You can be very impressive and be completely hollow. You can be very impressive and utterly ineffective at the things that actually matter. But you'll get treated as if you're valuable anyway, because humans respond to the performance just like peahens respond to the tail. The problem is that living this way is exhausting. Maintaining the tail is exhausting. Constantly performing is exhausting. Never being able to fail because failure would crack the persona is exhausting. Never being able to be yourself because yourself isn't impressive enough is exhausting. The peacock with a massive tail isn't happy. The peacock is stressed and vulnerable and dependent on constant validation. And the moment the validation stops, the moment he's not chosen, the moment someone doesn't recognize how impressive he is, the moment the performance fails to produce the result he needs, the peacock falls apart. Because the peacock's entire sense of self is wrapped up in the performance. If the performance fails, the peacock doesn't exist. This is the ego problem. This is what happens when you build your identity around being impressive instead of building it around being real. This is what happens when you optimize for appearance instead of substance. You end up like a peacock, carrying a tail you can barely manage, spending all your energy on display, vulnerable to anything that disrupts the performance, and utterly dependent on other people seeing you as valuable because you've never developed the capacity to see yourself as valuable. The irony is that the peacock thinks the tail makes him powerful. The peacock thinks the display makes him strong. But really, the tail is a chain. The display is a prison. The peacock is a slave to the performance, and he's convinced himself that slavery is freedom. And in human terms, that's what the ego does. The ego convinces you that your value is determined by how impressive you are. The ego convinces you that you need to perform constantly. The ego convinces you that being seen is the same as being known. And by the time you realize that none of this actually matters, you've spent your entire life carrying a tail, and you have no idea who you are without it. That's the ego problem of peacocks. And it's not a peacock problem. It's a human problem. We're all building tails. The question is whether we realize it before we spend our entire lives maintaining them.